Basically, I was asked to sort of come down and have a conversation with you about managing change and the culture shift that's actually engaged within the context of managing change. My background is in anthropology. I'm a cultural anthropologist. And so my orientation to this work has always been around anthropological context and sort of understanding why things happen, how we engage, what we do with people, et cetera. But because of the work that I've been doing, I've been in higher ed administration since, I think almost 25 years now. So I've worked at a private college, I've worked at Cal State, I've worked at the UC, but actually I haven't worked at a community college. I've attended community colleges, but I've never actually worked at a community college. However, I've done a lot of partnership work with community colleges, and so I have learned what it actually takes in terms of the work that's actually taking place at the community college. I've heard from my colleagues and worked very closely with them to develop partnerships, and we've been pretty successful in actually securing millions of dollars of grants actually based on that work and in working together. And so that's sort of my frame of reference and how I sort of come to this and the orientation with which I'm actually going to go through this presentation with you. So as you know from your own experience, change is sister or brother to chaos and confusion. There's an interrelationship between these activities, and that's often why people don't like change, because there's some level of chaos and there's some level of confusion, especially when there's a lot of miscommunication that takes place, or if not everybody has all of the information, which sort of leads to then people keeping things at arm's length, like Madeline was saying, or only wanting to be a part of change if you're a part of the planning process, like Monica was saying. And I think that's typically true for human behavior in general, right? I mean, I know that I don't necessarily like a lot of change if I can't be a part of the process, but at the same time, when I take these assessments, I find that I'm on the high end, pretty much ready to jump off a cliff if somebody were to say this is going to do really, something fabulous for me. I'll take that risk. So I'm a little bit different. But understanding context, I think, is really valuable in terms of why we even have these conversations about change in higher education. Right now, as many of you know, higher ed is changing pretty rapidly. But within that context, the US is actually changing pretty rapidly as well. This is a census information that was recently done, a report of distribution of populations. So the light purple, 2014 census information. The dark purple is projected census for 2060. And if you see what changes are taking place, the ethnic distribution of the United States is changing pretty dramatically. And we pretty much know this information because we see it in our student population. But we also know that in California, it changes even more drastically than this, right? So as a part of all of this, and in the context of education, we also know that there is a lot of ground that's being gained in high school education graduation attainment. So students are definitely graduating at a higher rate, but the students that are really doing well are the students that are the Latinos and African Americans. They're starting to gain a little bit higher than in previous years. And so the change is definitely taking place, and we're seeing this again in our institutions of higher education. But one of the pieces that we also know is that economically, and we say that education is a way out of the economical challenges a lot of our families actually face. But what we also know is that the working families below 200% poverty level, and this is also based off of a US Census data, American Community Survey. They survey about 3 million families throughout the year. And they're finding that the highest rates of poverty are actually still in the populations of the underrepresented minority, or the traditionally underrepresented minorities. So what is happening, and what do we do as these students actually come to colleges and universities? Because all of this sort of makes a difference in terms of how students are looking at education and what it is that they're looking for as a result of the time that they spend in institutions of higher education. So just a quick back and forth between these two slides. If we roughly have 55% of Latino families in poverty, and They are going to make up 33.5% of the population, and overall, the minority population is going to increase. And of course, for California, these numbers are much, much higher on the other end. What is that going to mean for the state of economics and for the United States in general and globally? And that's pretty much the kind of conversation that's constantly happening now these days in the higher education realm, right? So, for us, and when we look at it in higher education, we say higher education is changing. But what's interesting to me, and this is the Chief Information Officer from the University of Texas University of Texas System. She wrote an article or a piece for Inside Higher Ed last week, Ready or Not, Change is Coming. And these are direct statements from her article. But what struck me about this was that this is the reality that actually already exists for community colleges. And it has been the reality for community colleges and actually for Cal States for quite a long while. So we've been dealing with this change that everybody is saying is impending for a long time. And so we have a lot more experience and understanding. For us, the kind of change that's taking place, it's a little bit different. And what we know is that the return on investment is really starting to matter for these students. So the time and energy that they're spending in our institutions is something that they really want to get something out of, and it's not just something to do or a way to be able to find themselves. We hear this a lot at the Cal State level. The students come in and they demand that they get the grade that they deserve, even if they got the grade that they deserved. They just don't agree with that piece of it. And it's because their livelihoods are at stake and because they feel that they paid for that degree, therefore they should get that degree. And that's not exactly right? But we see more of that kind of a mentality with students these days than prior to. But it's because of these driving factors and because the economics of all of this really have an impact on the students' lives. So I think many of you may have already seen these slides about what your background is in terms of Mesa and the changes that have been sort of taking place, the flux that's been taking place with the numbers of students that are graduating. The fact that your associate degree for transfer has been gaining quite a bit of ground ever since SB 1440 really sort of took hold and everybody is sort of running to make that work. And the fact that you are actually the largest, I guess, out of all of the San Diego regional comparison schools, which I thought was pretty interesting because you've got an incredibly beautiful campus. And when I walked onto it, I thought, this is more like a four-year institution. Actually, your campus is better than the one that I currently work at in terms of buildings. Ours are really old, and you guys have a really beautiful campus. But that means that there's a lot of changes that are taking place and things are shifting and there are going to be bigger expectations, different expectations, maybe even higher expectations as a result of the position that you hold within the region and within the district itself. What does it all mean? What does it mean to you? What does it mean for your department and your unit? What does it mean for Mesa? And what does it mean within the context of the district itself? Have any of these conversations been taking place on the campus already? Sort of. I see some nods. In pockets. Are all of you a part of those conversations? Do you feel like you have a way to tap into those conversations at this point in time? A little bit?
A little bit here and there.
Yeah? Okay. Well, I think that part of it is that when you see all of the change that's happening in the external world, a lot of times we sort of say, okay, that's in the external world and it's not affecting me just yet, and we don't necessarily take the time to think about it. Then what happens is that the change starts coming and crashing in like a wave on the shores, and before you know it, you're already hit and you're wet. And I would say that preparing for change is probably the best way to be able to manage change and manage that culture shift, because it's really about that mental shift that you have to make. And this is what Buchenau, I think that's how you say their names, et al. I have references at the end of the slide so you can go back in and take a look at this. But they looked at 4 different studies and they identified these dimensions of change. And they said that process and context really matter and drive the outcome in terms of change. And so you can see that, if change is good or bad, then it's going to affect the outcome. Communication, support of supervisors, attitude of top management, participation in that change making makes a difference. The context, whether or not you trust your leadership, the politics around this, and the cohesion around the change efforts all make a difference in terms of the outcomes. And so there are emotional, cognitive, and intentional dimensions, and these are the things that they identified as being the key critical factors. They actually developed a variety of different surveys. The majority of it was geared towards businesses, again, for organizational behavior areas. And they surveyed 3,000 people to get a better sense of these dimensions, and that's how they sort of derive these three as being the top arenas. So when I like these word things because I think that it helps to sort of contextualize and understand what it is that I'm dealing with, why I'm dealing with things, and it sort of brings to mind some of the things that I'm feeling or thinking and just puts it out there. So when I looked up change, this is what I came up with. This is what appeared. Now, as you know, I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I score a lot by Clifford Geertz and his work in terms of thick description and understanding what that means. And I think that has real implications for change. And the reason is because, as you can see in here in the diagram even, the change and the chaos are nested within a lot of other words, a lot of other kinds of conditions. And they describe relationships, they describe situations, they describe, the setting, et cetera, down the line, right? And I think that in order for us to be able to manage and understand change, we need to understand this context. Not just the external scanning kind of context that you would do with a SWOT analysis, but also in terms of individual, unit-based, organizationally based kind of context in relation to these arenas. And we have to understand and interpret, because this is the other piece in terms of something that Clifford Geertz says, and something that I store a lot by, is that the everyday world in which the members of any community move, their taken for granted field of social action, is populated not by any bodies, faceless men or women without qualities, but by somebodies, concrete classes of determinate people, persons, positively characterized and appropriately labeled. He writes very old school. But to me, what this says is that we often take our interactions for granted. There is a set and a way that we actually operate that we've gotten used to and that we believe is the way things will always be. And until we start to sort of pull those pieces apart and understand what drives those different components, we won't understand how we relate to change and how change affects us and those of us, the others around us. This is the other component, and he went on to say that these systems are historically constructed, socially maintained, and individually applied. And I think this is so true when we're talking about change management, especially at an organizational level, at a unit level, or even at an individual level, because we don't often think about the historical context or even the socially maintained components of this. And we sort of plow through. All of you said that you sort of embrace change, that you're open to change, and that you're ready to and willing to move forward with that change. Well, imagine most people around you, you may be ready, but many people around you may not be ready. And so, and because they expect the status quo to continue, right? So they like the planned, they like the habitual. They want it to be very specific. And even for a wordly, this is pretty concrete in terms of how they've laid all of the different words out and even the coloring of this, right? I mean, there's some level of order to this. And I think that when we go in and we start to look at what it means when you're not willing to change or not changing, and you look at some of the words that are here, like predictability, normalized, controllable, guaranteed, reasoned, order, when you say and propose something for change, it's almost like you're saying, this is not what you want. And people sometimes interpret that by what we don't say or what we don't communicate. And that's when everything sort of goes to, goes awry, and actually that change management doesn't work so well. So all of this is to say change is hard. It's not necessarily hard for those of you in the room, but it's usually pretty difficult for everybody else who are not necessarily willing and open to this level of change. But change is good, as long as you go first. And that's often how we feel about these things for those, again, that are not willing to engage and not willing to necessarily have these conversations because they're a little bit change averse, right? So the question becomes, how do we prepare ourselves and others for change? How have you done it in the past?
Involve people from the very beginning and try to get buy-in and commitment to the ideas.
And how much time does that take?
Well, it takes a lot if you do it properly, especially, you know. It's certainly, I think, one of the integral parts of the whole thing, and probably should take as much time as the rest of the process, the change itself.
And how do you balance, and this for everybody, but how do you balance that in terms of the investment of time and energy that needs to be put forth to involve everybody with the kinds of pressures and the kinds of competing priorities that you have to deal with on a day-to-day basis?
Well, I think sometimes things suffer as a result of needing to invest that much energy and time. There isn't a sense of balance. You have to kind of go into an imbalance so that you can apply the pressure you need to inform people, to communicate, so that they understand the potential for the good that the change could bring.
So I haven't told you anything that you didn't already know, right? But how often do you have time to sit and think about these things? I think that that's one of the key components. And for me, the key word here is prepare. Again, ourselves and others, because I don't think that we can actually manage change or even orchestrate change if we aren't prepared. And we have to think about it in a very systematic way in order for changes to actually occur. Good changes, positive changes, not unintended, consequences kinds of changes. And so I think that, as administrators, which I think most of you are in the room, it's really key in terms of understanding how is it that you sort of approach this and how much time and energy do you put towards it and what do you do with it in terms of the competing priorities. Because I think for us that's probably the biggest challenge. I have maybe about 3 or 4 different projects that I'm constantly working on, and they're very disparate in a number of different directions. And I find that I have to throw one up in the air and run and go take care of something else and throw the next one up in the air and come back and make sure that I catch this one, and that I've thrown it up high enough that I can actually have something continue while I'm gone. It's sort of having that motion continue. But I've definitely dropped a few balls, right? And we always use that analogy, and I find it sort of amusing that we constantly use this idea of juggling to be able to do everything that needs to be done because we have competing priorities, and it doesn't seem that those competing priorities actually lessen. But I would say that if you are prepared for the changes, and if you think about doing the preparations ahead of time, what actually Stephen Covey calls quadrant 2 work. Are you familiar with Stephen Covey? I store a lot by that. I think that actually does help us to manage the change process a little bit better and a little bit more effectively. Really, as human beings, I don't think we like change very much, honestly, because we like our comfort zone. We like to know what we can expect, and we expect what we think we're going to get, right? And so we are not really very change tolerant, if you will, which I find fascinating on so many different levels, because our perceptions of our ability to be change ready are vastly different. But this is, I think, really the crux of the problem when we come to a situation where massive changes are taking place. We think we are change ready. We think that we are open to those changes, etc. And we often wonder, then what's wrong with everybody else I'm ready. What's wrong with everybody else? Why can't we all get on the same page? What are the various different issues? And so, as Leslie was saying earlier, it takes a lot more work. We have to do so much legwork in terms of making all those communications so explicit, because everybody takes something else out of the same communication that they receive. And it's just like this. We often can't even judge well in terms of our own readiness state until we sort of look at it black and white and sort of get a better sense of, what our levels for ambiguity might be, or for adaptability or confidence in this kind of change arena, et cetera. My staff, when I did this a while back ago, probably about 10, 15 years ago, when my former institution was going through massive amounts of change, were not surprised at all. I scored pretty much somewhere between 22 and 26 all the way on all of the different components. And they were like, how? Yeah, well, okay, we understand why. And you make our lives miserable because you are constantly morphing. And I didn't think that I was actually morphing all that much, that I wasn't, sending or setting up things that were constantly changing in their environment. But every little piece of new item that I was introducing was affecting some of them very, very negatively, because they couldn't keep track. They were overwhelmed. And even though it was a positive change, it was still negative for them because it was a change. And I think that's really the biggest lesson I learned from this was that even a positive change may not be a good change, because people don't like change. And change ultimately is really difficult. And lasting change, impactful change, positive change, it's hard to actually engineer and to actually keep going over time. So some of the definitions is tolerance for ambiguity, able to live with uncertainty. You like surprises, these are great things. Adaptability, shift expectations due to new realities, rebound from adversity quickly. So some descriptors for adaptability. And adventurousness, wanting to take risk, willing to pursue the unknown, and convergent as well as divergent thinking. So identifying those things that are similar as well as different, and being able to utilize that information, and being able to see patterns around you, in the data or what in the resources and information. Resourcefulness, make the most of any situation, using resources at hand to make plans, accessing networks. This is something that I actually store a lot by. There's a paper by Granovetter, he's a sociologist, called The Strength of Weak Ties. And he talks a lot about, the networks that you have. Your strong ties are not the ones that you'll actually get the most resources from. The ties that you get, the stronger resources or the better resources or maybe more important resources in terms of what you need to do, come from the weak ties. And it has to do with the way that we actually interact with individuals. So if you're interested in those kinds of networking analysis papers, that's a really good one to look into. Optimism, the glass is half full, not half empty. Confidence, that you have the ability to handle any difficult situation, any kind of thing that might arise, and that you have the self-esteem and self-efficacy to be able to deal with these different challenges and the changes that take place. And a passion for new experiences, for the excitement of it all as well as the challenge of it all. And you look at these changes as such. It's not always easy to do, right? And people, especially when change is done to you. If you're not the agent of change, it's really, really hard to swallow. When something is done to you, then it becomes really difficult because we don't feel in control. So why change? What's the sense of urgency? Are you satisfied right now with the status quo? Are you satisfied? No? Are you complacent with what's in the status quo? Are you comfortable with what's currently happening? Well, if people answer yes to these three questions, change will be difficult. Because it's too comfortable. At the end of the day, it's just too comfortable. We don't like change, and if we're already comfortable and satisfied, there's no reason for me to change. And it doesn't matter what that outcome is. It's really about me in the end in terms of how I interact and what's going to happen with me. And I know that sounds awfully selfish and a little bit pessimistic, but at the same time, I think that that's really the sort of the reality. And when we have conversations with people about change, we have to get at this. So how do we encourage positive change? Provide a reason. There needs to be a cognitively sound basis for change. So going back to Buchanan, they were saying that there needs to be a logical, intelligent, and worthy component to making these changes actually occur. You have to appeal to people on that cognitive level intellectually, and they have to understand it. And you come across people, I'm sure you've heard people say, I understand why this needs to change, but I don't like it, right? Or, I understand why this needs to change, but I'm not going to do it. Those, I think, are the really, really difficult ones, but I've come across a lot of them. The second piece is we have to empower people to change. There has to be intentional opportunities for reflection, planning, and execution. I think one of the things that we find, and this comes from the book and now as well as some motivation literature with Conger and Pierce, but we often, when change starts happening, it sort of comes rapid fire, right? Things just keep going and it snowballs and things seem to feel out of control. And then it really does get out of control. And part of the problem is that we may have spent some time thinking and reflecting about what we should be doing and doing some planning, but often we don't actually give enough time for the execution. We shortchange that. And we do a lot these days with SWOT analyses, strategic plans, and I mean, up the yin-yang. I mean, I saw all of the strategic plans and all of the master plans that this college has. And I know I've been a part of many, many of those at all of the institutions that I've been. But then we don't necessarily give ample time for execution. And then what Kolb talks about in experiential learning as being that the cycle of experiences and thinking about that cycle and having the reflective component go back into the execution and sort of this piece of it sort of continues all the way through. And when we don't do that, we shortchange ourselves because that's when I think change really gets shortchanged. Leslie, you had a question?
Well, just a comment about the reflection stage. Not at this job, but I've had a couple of major changes to push through in past positions. And the reflection period was so important, not only to reflect on the process of a change, but when we were really stuck and having a hard time, I bring in information about the different stages of change and the different people, you know, the resistors and the embracers. Yeah. And we talk about that and not put any value on any of the different stages, but just do an exercise to recognize where we might be individually and as a group. And that would make so much difference because it gave people an insight to why this feels so bad or why it feels good. And it was really a very positive activity that would play into that reflection stage. It always had good outcomes. It kind of took the jam away and let us move forward.
Yeah. And it's because, again, we're recognizing where every individual is and how they're sort of negotiating the issues or the change that's sort of taking place and giving them an opportunity to engage, right? But we don't often take a lot of time for that. And I think that reflection piece also gets at this. It helps them to care. Right? We answer, you know, what's in it for me in my department or unit, and that's not a bad question. We don't talk about this as being something negative. We turn it into a positive because we're reflecting, we're talking about the impacts, we're thinking about the long-term outcomes that we're trying to get at as a result of the change. And I think that this component really requires, as Buchanan and Amabile and Fisher actually say, it requires an emotional investment. People need to feel emotionally invested in the changes that are actually taking place and have a sense of ownership around that, even if it's very small, some part. because they have to have a sense of belonging. How many of you guys have read the book Who Moved the Cheese, I think it's called? Who Moved My Cheese, that's it, yeah. So I loved that book. I used to use that as an example, again, with my staff in talking about change management and anticipation and understanding what's happening around you and preparing for change, et cetera, down the line. And not being like the two little mousemen at the end of the book who lament the fact that, their cheese pile is gone and they don't know what happened to it, even though they saw it shrinking every day, day after day, as they came to get their cheese. And I think that that's really sort of what this whole change management and culture shift process is all about. It's really trying to get at these three pieces, but again, this is set up in the context of competing priorities. All of this takes an incredible amount of time, right? It takes a lot of energy, and it takes a lot of planning, and it takes a lot of thoughtfulness, and it requires constant management. And we don't always have the wherewithal or the capacity to be able to do that. And so I've been in situations where people will be like, well, Jeannie, you did that great little get together and had all those conversations. Then what? What did you do for me, after that? What's going on now? And I ran out of time. I didn't have time to be able to continue these conversations or have a retreat every semester or whatever the situation might have been. But those expectations by those that we're working with, they have them. No matter what you want to do to dispel it, no matter what you want to do in terms of trying to communicate to them otherwise, they have those expectations, and we have to give them opportunity to be able to share that so that they can be a part of the process. So I wanted to spend the last 20 minutes or so on case studies. And these are just based off of my own experiences on the campuses that I've worked at, and in terms of the kinds of situations around change. So one is a service learning integration example. So I have been a part of this service learning movement, if you will, before there was a hyphen, whether or not there should be a hyphen. So way back in the early 1990s, late 1980s, actually. And so the conversations were always about what is service learning and what should it look like. At the end of the day, fast forward 20 years, this is what it sort of comes down to. And it's about the pedagogical perspective of the instructor. The sage on the stage and the guide on the side. And I try not to say versus, right? These both pedagogical perspectives are valid, and they need to be utilized in different situations. But it is a shift and it is a change, right? And in trying to make this shift happen for some faculty and for some courses and in certain situations, we had to understand the context. We needed to understand what outcomes the faculty wanted in terms of their course outcomes. And we needed to understand the types of students that we were working with, whether they were in the elementary level, high school, or the college levels. And we needed to make sure we set it up so that it was doable and that it wasn't going to be too much work for any one individual to actually take this on. But there are some really key distinctions in terms of just historical, pedagogical perspectives. This is not meant to be a negative, but it is sort of the sense, we open the lids and we pour information in kind of an idea, right? And here with the asset-based models, the funds of knowledge models, it's a sense that everyone contributes, that the students are coming in with information and knowledge. That, I think, is probably the most difficult piece for, in the past, historically, that has been the most difficult transition for faculty to make. And I think that, though, after 20, 25 years of this conversation, it has changed, though, drastically. When we first started these conversations in the early 1990s, there was none of this. People wouldn't even have this conversation at all, because the pedagogical component was so staunchly over here with this mode of teaching. And now, this is probably more the norm. And I think that we've actually shifted and placed value on this side of the house in terms of having everybody participate and learn together and providing value and expertise, and that there's an acknowledgement, a shared knowledge creation and ownership that we actually store a lot by these days. And so we've really seen a huge shift that actually takes place. But it took 25 years in the making. And originally, we did it by putting in policies and making people do it. We gave them money so that they would try it and test it. We gave them training, professional development, so that they would include it and integrate it. And all of those things are still the items, the toolbox that we would go to in order to be able to facilitate change, even now. But we have to have a long view. And I guess I bring up this example because this side of the house, the guide on the side piece of it, is more normal in today's world, but it was not 20 years ago, 25 years ago, and it was definitely a very difficult conversation. And now there are books, there's lots of research, et cetera. Back then there was nothing. And so we were just going based off of a hunch and pushing this forward because we thought that it was the right thing to do, and this is what students really needed in order to be able to grow as critical thinkers and democratic participants in society. So right now, this is a project that I'm working on currently, and it's adopting new ways of advising. And the challenge at my current institution has been that we are on a dispersed platform. So everybody has access to different pieces of information and are making decisions about students' lives, matriculation, coursework, et cetera, based on a variety of different kinds of information. There's a distinctness between who the major faculty advisors are, providing upper division major advising, and those that are GE advisors and on the lower division components. These are the individuals that are actually working in separate offices on articulation with community colleges as well, and trying to get a better sense of what courses matter and what courses don't. As you can imagine, we have utter chaos. And most higher ed institutions, actually, at the 4-year level, this is what we look like. And that's why a lot of your students don't make it through when they get to the 4-year level, because it is a complete, information chaotic mess. And it's very, very difficult because students can't navigate this. What we're trying to move to is this coordinated platform. It sounds great. Don't you think everybody would want to go there, especially since it'll increase graduation rates and help students to get their degrees on time, et cetera, down the line? Do you think everybody wants to go here?
I think in theory, the practices are different. I think they want to. It seems logical to do something like that.
But why do you think that they don't want to do it?
From a student's perspective, I would think that they would not want to coordinate it because they would think it's too difficult. And they would say, I hear a lot of my students say, you tell me. I need you, even though we've gone through all of their ed plan, everything's laid out for them, and yet they still have to come in because they want to really make sure that they're taking the right classes, even though we've gone over it over and over and over and over. They don't want to make a mistake.
So that level of responsibility is something that they don't necessarily want to own, right? Any other reasons why people might not want to go to this side?
They might not hear what they want to hear. Because I'm dispersed. Okay, I don't like this answer. I'll go ask somebody else.
Good point.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Other reasons?
I think perhaps maybe some could argue that what we have works. Why break something that works? And if it's not perfect, we know nothing's perfect, but if it seems to work, why change?
Right.
I think that all of those reasons I've heard, but the one that always gets me is that I found people throwing rocks at this because this would look bad if this succeeded.
I could see that.
So it goes back to what's in it for me. It's going to make me look bad because I didn't, or hadn't, or whatever reason, didn't go to this, and now this is going to be successful. Therefore, I don't want to be a part of that. And I think that's probably the most ugly side of change that I've experienced, but it's not the first time that I've seen it. But it is a reality, right? And so I don't gloss over that, only because I think that that's something that you have to deal with head on when you're managing change and when you're trying to look at culture shift. You have to know that some people are just going to be ugly about it for lots of reasons. And you have to figure out, how do you still get them to that other side? Now, there may be those that you can't get to that other side. And that you may just have to figure out how to cage them and keep them from causing any additional harm to everybody else. So you're embracing Madeline at a farther distance, that can work. Somebody holds and somebody else continues and moves on with the change efforts. But those are the kinds of strategies that we have to think through. And I didn't actually put it into the slide, but I often create thought maps about how to go about change and what all the various different relationships are. Because I find that putting it down on paper and understanding the kind of domino effects and the unintended impacts that can occur when I put a particular change in motion helps me to understand and anticipate what the reactions are going to be from individuals who may not necessarily want to be a part of the change movement. On the flip, I've seen some really incredible and powerful changes take place because something happens serendipitously and people accept it and they see the value and they just start moving forward with it and they become that change agent that I never was expecting. And then my job is to make sure that I support that change agent in moving forward, because now they're carrying my cause and taking it forward. So the last example I'm going to sort of go over with you is this one. So Institution A was established in 1957. It had 5 presidents since its inception, 20 years of consistent leadership. Institution B was established in 1960, 10 presidents since inception, and consistent flux in leadership. That's what it was consistent in, the fluctuation in leadership. So my question is, which institution experienced significant change?
Well, it appears B has, just because of the number of presidents.
It's hard to say, though.
Yeah, I mean, just from what we see here, it
Right.
seems B.
And A, if you've had 20 years of doing things this way, and now it's time to change, that might be a little bit
Yeah,
tougher.
we're not sure about the last president.
Right.
You were saying that it's both, or A? Okay, why do you say it's A?
Well, same as what Madeline is alluding to, and that is A has had the stable whatever for all these years, and then all of a sudden it's change.
Okay.
While B is more accustomed to the change.
There you go.
Significant change.
And they're used to it.
They're used to
But
the
they
change.
don't like
I
it.
think it's hard to say without knowing about the leadership.
So when we go back to that, I cannot say their name without looking at it, but that long name, the No, they talk about that leadership component and the trust piece, right, as being critical in terms of how this actually sort of pans out. And I would say that the answer is both. These are both real examples. This is my former institution, and Institution B is the institution that I'm at now. And Institution A had measured strategic growth during that 20-year period. It had established infrastructure and policies and procedures and systems. There was a deliberative change process. There were fit gap analyses, and the change was relatively slow. Institution B, inconsistent growth, established yet not well understood systems and policies, and people were pretty reactionary to change, and somewhat are. There are some overlaps in different kinds of arenas, as well as very wide gaps. And so, and the changes were rapid, sort of rapid fire. And that made a difference then in terms of how they engage and how they look at change and what they talk about in terms of change. So these days people say that everybody is on initiative fatigue. That's a common rhetoric that we hear because people are just bone tired. And so, I don't know that either is necessarily wrong. I think that there's definitely lots of reasons why these kinds of things happen. But I think this is really more the difficulty is in terms of the envisioning and whether or not this change happens because it's self-determined and directed or because it's politically directed and there are identity crises as a result of it. And I think that sort of gets at the initiative fatigue component. Because Institution B started out with a different sense of who they were originally. And then they were moved and they had a different focus and different change in terms of the direction that they needed to move forward in. And that caused then a change or a distancing between the mission of the organization. And when that distancing happened, people sort of lost their way. So the lessons that I've learned thus far with change management requires understanding motivations, establishing clear lines of communication, building trust, building relationships, having infrastructure to build upon, a lot of patience, and a lot of tolerance. And I don't think that these are necessarily easy things to do. It takes a lot more work and a lot more energy to be able to do these activities and to do them well, and to be able to engage people and to be a part of that process and in terms of making change really stick. Any comments on these components?
I think it's the second thing, establishing clear lines of communication. Sometimes, although people might not accept things, or even if they do, I think if you have those, lines of communication, you're always talking, you pre-talk about, some things that are coming up, you demonstrate or you show them the data behind it. In advance of the change, I think it's a little easier. People might not accept it, but they can respect the process in which it happened.
I think that's a really good point about respecting the process and the transparency. I mean, I think that's when people really get bent out of shape, is when people say, oh, it's transparent, and only a few were in the know, and it was only transparent to them. And that, I think, really makes a big difference in terms of how people, trust whether or not you're really telling them the truth or are truly invested in having you be a part of that process of change. I think that change management requires constant vigilance. And it's sort of a never-ending game. And it's one that we have to be passionate about in order to be able to stay, sort of wedded to it. And this analysis around this piece, the tolerance for ambiguity, I think is really, really key, because we don't ever have really clear-cut answers, even when we are the change agents and the change makers. But I think that if we sort of think about it from the other person's perspective as we're looking at change, and understand what it's like and put ourselves in the other person's shoes of what happens when we're not the change makers or change agents and on the receiving end, then it helps us to sort of reframe and understand how we might be able to have these conversations a little bit differently, and be a little bit more open to involving individuals at the appropriate points in time as we move forward with change management. Any other comments or questions?
Well, I have a comment. I guess I recognize and realize the importance of all those steps. But I think the frustration that I felt is we are all so busy. So there's a lot of times when you're trying to do all those things and you are doing them, but they aren't reaching people because they're just too busy to read those communications. And then you reach the point where, okay, we got to move forward with this. And then you have the people that are coming up and say, well, how come nobody else ever asked me?
Yeah.
So that's sort of a challenge that I see is that I am asking, but you're not hearing me ask.
Yeah.
And then you don't realize that it happened until it's in your face
Right.
and affecting you.
Right.
So I'm not sure how to, but I'm also very respectful of how busy people are. And it's
Yeah.
hard to say, drop that and pay attention to this. That's the challenge I feel like.
So one of the things that I found that really works in that is formal communications don't seem to work in those situations. They block it out because they're on information overload. So I activate the grapevine. And so by activating the grapevine and having conversations with key individuals and making sure that they're kept in the know, they keep everybody else in the know. And that's actually something that's been documented with organizational behavioralists. Bandura and has done some work on it, and I forget the other person, but they've looked at the activation of the grapevine as one of those key components of a healthy organization. And so it's something that you might want to try employing. So I don't expect you to answer these questions here and now, but these are some things that I just leave for you to think about, and maybe as you think about further conversations around how to manage change as your institution becomes the Hispanic serving institution, what that means. How will you continue to build your brand and identity? I see all kinds of flags on the campus and the degree programs that you have sort of advertised, et cetera. And to sort of really think about, does being an HSI change your brand or your identity as a campus? And if so, how? What do you do about it? What does that look like? Does it look, and who are the messages for? Is it to your internal audience, or is it to your external audience, the students, or is it to the other administrators and faculty members? And what's your vision for change, and to what end? And these are the workshop's done, but this is the real work that needs to be undertaken. And so, this is, I think, really the next steps, and it's going to be an internal process, and you all have to be the leaders of those conversations and to be the managers of that change. So that's it for me. Here are the references, and I will, the PowerPoint will be here, so if you want a copy, we can send you a copy as well.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.